Rome was never meant to become an empire. For centuries, it stood as a republic, a system designed to prevent exactly that outcome. Power was divided, carefully balanced between elected officials, the Senate, and the people. No single man was supposed to rise above the state. That was the idea. That was the promise. And for a long time, it worked, at least on the surface. But as Rome expanded beyond Italy, conquering vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, the system began to crack under its own success. Wealth flooded into Rome, but it didn't reach everyone. The elite grew richer, buying land, controlling politics, and tightening their grip on power. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens, especially soldiers returning from long wars, found themselves with nothing. Their farms were gone, their debts unbearable, their future uncertain. The gap between rich and poor widened, and with it, anger began to grow. The Republic, once seen as fair and stable, now looked corrupt and broken. And when people lose faith in institutions, they start searching for individuals, strong leaders who promise change. That shift was the beginning of the end. Roman generals began to realize something dangerous. Their armies were loyal not to the Republic, but to them personally. Soldiers followed the man who paid them, rewarded them, and promised them land. Loyalty shifted from state to commander, and that transformed politics into something far more unstable. Power no longer came from votes or tradition, it came from military strength. Civil wars became inevitable. One general would rise, then another, each claiming to restore order, each bringing Rome closer to collapse. Alliances formed and shattered, betrayals became common, and the Republic slowly consumed itself from within. Out of this chaos emerged a figure unlike any before him, a man who understood both the weaknesses of the system and the power of the people. Julius Caesar was not the most obvious candidate for dominance, but he possessed something far more important. Ambition without limits, combined with a rare ability to connect with the masses. He didn't just play the political game, he rewrote it. Instead of relying solely on the Senate, he built his power through the people and, more importantly, through his army. His campaigns in Gaul transformed him from a politician into a legend. Year after year, he won battles, expanded Roman territory, and enriched both himself and his soldiers. His victories were not just military, they were psychological. Rome began to see him not as a servant of the Republic, but as something greater. And that terrified the Senate. Because Caesar represented a new kind of power, one that didn't depend on tradition or approval, but on loyalty and force. When the Senate ordered him to give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, it wasn't just a political move, it was a direct attempt to stop him. But by that point, Caesar had gone too far to turn back. Standing at the edge of the Rubicon River, he faced a decision that would define history. Crossing it with his army meant declaring war on Rome itself. It meant destroying the republic he claimed to serve. But not crossing it meant losing everything. In that moment, the fate of Rome balanced on a single choice. And when Caesar stepped forward, leading his army across the river, he didn't just start a civil war, he ended an era. The war that followed was swift but decisive. Caesar moved with precision, defeating his enemies one by one, forcing them into retreat or surrender. His greatest rival, Pompey, once a powerful ally, became his ultimate obstacle. Their conflict symbolized more than a personal rivalry, it was the final struggle for control over Rome itself. When Pompey was eventually defeated and killed, Caesar stood unchallenged. He returned to Rome not as a general seeking approval, but as a ruler who had taken power by force. Yet he understood something crucial. Romans hated kings. The memory of monarchy still carried deep fear and resentment. So instead of declaring himself king, Caesar chose a different path. He accepted titles that appeared temporary, controlled, almost harmless. Dictator. Then dictator for 10 years. And finally, dictator for life. That was the turning point. Because even without a crown, everyone understood what it meant. The Republic still existed in name, but in reality, power had been concentrated in the hands of one man. Caesar began to reshape Rome, introducing reforms, reorganizing governance, stabilizing the economy, and addressing some of the inequalities that had fueled unrest. To many, he was exactly what Rome needed, a strong leader who could bring order to chaos. But to others, he represented something far more dangerous. Because if Caesar could rise to absolute power, what would stop future rulers from doing the same? A group of senators, driven by fear and a belief that they were defending the Republic, began to plot against him. They saw themselves not as traitors, but as protectors of Rome's original ideals. The plan was simple. Remove Caesar, and the Republic would be restored. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Caesar entered the Senate, unaware that he was walking into a carefully prepared trap. What began as a gathering quickly turned into an execution. Surrounded by men he trusted, Caesar was attacked without warning. Blades struck again and again, 23 times in total. It wasn't just an assassination, it was a statement. A desperate attempt to turn back time. And for a brief moment, it seemed like it might work. The conspirators believed they had saved Rome. They believed the Republic would rise again now that the threat was gone. But they had misunderstood the situation entirely. Caesar's death didn't restore balance, it created a vacuum. And in that vacuum, chaos returned stronger than ever. The Republic, already weakened, now had no central figure, no stability, no clear direction. Instead of peace, Rome descended back into conflict. New alliances formed, new rivalries emerged, and the cycle of power struggles began again. But this time, the stakes were even higher. Because now, the idea of one-man rule was no longer unthinkable, it had already happened. And that changed everything. From the chaos that followed Caesar's death, a new figure began to rise, quietly, strategically, almost unnoticed at first. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, did not seem like the obvious successor. He was young, inexperienced, and underestimated by nearly everyone around him. But that underestimation became his greatest advantage. While others fought openly for power, Octavian moved carefully, building alliances, gaining support, and positioning himself exactly where he needed to be. He understood something that many others did not. Power was not just about strength, it was about perception, timing, and control. Forming a temporary alliance with Mark Antony and Lepidus, he helped establish the Second Triumvirate, a three-man rule that aimed to stabilize Rome. But this alliance was never meant to last. It was a tool, a step toward something greater. As expected, tensions grew, trust eroded, and eventually, the alliance collapsed. One by one, Octavian eliminated his rivals, not always through direct confrontation, but through strategy and patience. Lepidus was pushed aside, leaving Octavian and Antony as the final contenders. Their conflict would decide the future of Rome. Unlike previous civil wars, this was not just a fight for power, it was a fight for control over the narrative of Rome itself. Antony aligned himself with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, creating an image that Octavian used against him. He portrayed Antony not as a Roman leader, but as someone who had been influenced, even corrupted, by foreign power. This narrative was powerful, and it worked. Public opinion began to shift. When the final battle came at Actium, it was more than a military confrontation, it was the climax of years of political maneuvering. Octavian's victory was decisive. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, and with their fall, the last major opposition to Octavian disappeared. For the first time in years, Rome was no longer divided. There was one man at the center of power. But Octavian had learned from Caesar's fate. He knew that openly declaring himself ruler could lead to the same outcome. So instead of repeating the past, he changed the approach entirely. He didn't destroy the Republic, he transformed it from within. He kept its structures, its titles, its appearance. The Senate still existed. Elections still happened. Institutions remained. But behind all of it, real power belonged to him. It was a system built not on obvious control, but on subtle dominance. In 27 BC, Octavian received a new title. Augustus. It was more than just a name, it was a symbol. A signal that a new era had begun. And with that moment, the Roman Empire was born. Not through a single event, not through a declaration, but through a gradual shift, a transformation shaped by crisis, ambition, and the decisions of individuals who saw opportunity where others saw collapse. Rome did not fall when it became an empire. It adapted. It evolved into something stronger, more centralized, more enduring. But at its core, the story remained the same. A system designed to prevent absolute power had been undone by the very forces it created. And in the end, it wasn't just the system that changed. It was the idea of Rome itself. But the story of Rome does not end with Augustus. In many ways, it only begins there. Because what Octavian, now Augustus, created was something the world had never truly seen before. A system where one man held absolute power without ever openly admitting it. He did not call himself king. He did not wear a crown. Instead, he chose a title that sounded almost harmless, princeps, meaning the first citizen. It was a brilliant illusion. To the public, it looked like the Republic still existed. The Senate still met. Elections still took place. Laws were still passed. Everything seemed familiar, unchanged, almost normal. But beneath that surface, the reality was completely different. Augustus controlled the treasury, the provinces, and most importantly, the loyalty of Rome's legions. And in Rome, whoever controlled the legions controlled everything. What made Augustus different from Caesar was not just his power, it was how he used it. Caesar had moved too fast, too openly. He had taken control in a way that frightened the elite and made his enemies desperate. Augustus, on the other hand, moved slowly, carefully, almost invisibly. He did not destroy the system. He absorbed it. He allowed people to believe they still had a voice, while quietly ensuring that no decision could ever truly go against him. And after years of chaos, that illusion was exactly what Rome needed. Because the truth was simple. People were tired. Decades of civil war had broken the Republic long before Augustus finished it. Entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but conflict, uncertainty, and fear. Stability was no longer a political ideal, it was a necessity. And Augustus delivered it. This period became known as the Pax Romana, a time of relative peace and stability that would last for generations. Trade expanded across vast distances. Cities grew into centers of culture and power. Roads stretched across continents, connecting provinces that had once been worlds apart. For many, life improved in ways that had been unimaginable during the final years of the Republic. And that is how empires truly begin, not just through conquest, but through acceptance. Because power is strongest not when it is forced, but when it is welcomed. Augustus understood something that few rulers ever fully grasp. Fear can give you control, but stability earns you loyalty. And loyalty is what sustains power over time. But even the most carefully built systems carry within them the seeds of future problems. Because an empire built around one man raises a dangerous question. What happens when that man is gone? Augustus ruled for decades, long enough to shape Rome in his image. But he could not rule forever. And unlike a republic, where power could be transferred through established institutions, the empire faced a new kind of uncertainty. There was no clear rulebook for succession. No guaranteed system for choosing the next ruler. And that uncertainty would become one of the greatest weaknesses of the empire. When Augustus finally died, Rome did not collapse, but it held its breath. Because now, for the first time, the system would be tested without its creator. His successor, Tiberius, stepped into a role that had no clear definition. Was he a ruler? A servant of the state? A continuation of Augustus, or something entirely different? The answer was unclear, and that ambiguity would define the future of Rome. Some emperors would follow Augustus' model, ruling with restraint, maintaining the illusion of balance. Others would abandon it completely, ruling with fear, excess, and absolute authority. And with each new emperor, the true nature of the system became harder to hide. Because over time, the illusion of the republic faded. The Senate became weaker. The emperor became stronger. And what had once been carefully disguised became openly accepted. Rome was no longer pretending. It was an empire, in every sense of the word. But the transformation that began with Augustus did more than change Rome's political system. It changed the way power itself was understood. It showed that control did not need to be loud to be absolute. That the most effective rulers were not always the most obvious ones. And that sometimes, the strongest empires are not built through sudden conquest, but through slow, almost invisible change. The fall of the Republic was not a single event. It was a process, a series of decisions, actions, and consequences that unfolded over decades. Caesar lit the fire. Augustus shaped what came after. And together, they transformed Rome into something that would dominate the known world for centuries. But in the end, the question remains. Was this transformation inevitable? Or could the Republic have survived if different choices had been made? Because history is not just a story of what happened, it is a reflection of what could have been. And in the case of Rome, the line between those two is thinner than it seems. But the longer the empire existed, the clearer its hidden weakness became. Augustus had built a system that depended on one thing above all else: control at the very top. As long as the emperor was strong, intelligent, and careful, Rome thrived. But the system itself offered no guarantees. It did not ensure that the next ruler would be wise, or just, or even stable. And sooner or later, that flaw began to show. Because power, when concentrated in one person, does not just shape the state, it reveals the nature of the individual who holds it. After Augustus and his immediate successors, Rome entered a dangerous phase. Some emperors tried to maintain order, to preserve the balance Augustus had created. Others abandoned restraint entirely. And when that happened, the empire itself began to change. Because an empire is not just territory, it is trust. And when trust disappears, even the strongest structures begin to weaken. Emperors like Caligula and Nero became symbols of what unchecked power could become. Their rule was marked not by stability, but by excess, unpredictability, and fear. Decisions were no longer guided by long-term strategy, but by impulse. The Senate, once a central part of Roman governance, had been reduced to something closer to a formality. It could advise, but it could not oppose. It could exist, but it could not control. And the army, the true foundation of imperial power, became the ultimate deciding force. Because just as generals once realized that soldiers were loyal to them, not the Republic, a new reality emerged. Now, soldiers were loyal to the emperor but only as long as he satisfied them. And that created a dangerous cycle. Emperors needed the army to stay in power. The army expected rewards, loyalty, and strong leadership. And if an emperor failed to deliver, the same force that protected him could remove him. This was no longer a system of governance. It was a balance of power held together by expectation, fear, and opportunity. And when that balance broke, the consequences were immediate. The year of the 4 emperors was a perfect example. In a single year, Rome saw multiple rulers rise and fall, each backed by different legions, each claiming legitimacy, each ultimately proving how unstable the system had become. Power was no longer transferred, it was taken. And this pattern would repeat itself again and again. Civil wars did not disappear with the empire. They evolved. Instead of being fought between competing visions of the Republic, they became struggles between individuals fighting for absolute control. And every conflict weakened Rome just a little more. But despite all this, the empire did not collapse. In fact, it continued to expand, to build, to dominate. This is what makes Rome so fascinating. Even with its internal instability, it remained one of the most powerful forces in history. Roads, laws, architecture, military organization, Rome influenced the world in ways that would last for centuries. But beneath that strength, the cracks never truly disappeared. Because the system still depended on one thing. The emperor. A single point of failure in a structure that spanned continents. And over time, that dependency would become harder to manage. As the empire grew larger, it became more difficult to control. Communication slowed. Borders stretched. Enemies pressed from all sides. And internally, corruption, economic strain, and political instability continued to build. What Augustus had created was brilliant, but it was also fragile in ways that were not immediately visible. Because the illusion of stability can last for a long time until suddenly, it doesn't. And when that moment comes, everything that once seemed unshakable can begin to fall apart. The transformation from republic to empire had solved many of Rome's immediate problems. It had brought order out of chaos, unity out of division. But it had also created new challenges, ones that would not be fully understood until much later. Because every system, no matter how powerful, carries within it the seeds of its own future. And Rome was no exception. The question was no longer whether the Republic could return, that chapter was closed. The real question was whether the empire itself could endure what it had become. And the answer to that question would take centuries to unfold. And yet, despite all its flaws, the Roman Empire did endure. For centuries, it stood as the dominant power of the known world, stretching across continents, shaping cultures, defining laws, and leaving a legacy that would outlive it by millennia. But the question is not just how Rome rose, it is how such a powerful system could ever fall. Because empires do not collapse overnight. They erode. Slowly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. The same forces that once built Rome, ambition, expansion, concentration of power, began to work against it. As generations passed, the memory of the Republic faded completely. The idea of shared power, of balance, of limitation, those concepts no longer defined Rome. What remained was authority centered in one figure, supported by an complex system that required constant maintenance. And maintaining an empire of that scale was no simple task. Borders had to be defended against growing external threats, tribes, rival states, migrating peoples, all testing the limits of Roman strength. At the same time, internal pressures intensified. Economic instability, heavy taxation, political corruption, and a constant need to secure loyalty from the army placed enormous strain on the system. The empire became harder to manage, harder to control, and more dependent than ever on the quality of its leadership. And that was the core problem that never truly went away. Because no system built around individuals can guarantee the quality of those individuals. Some emperors were capable, disciplined, and strategic. They stabilized the empire, pushed back its enemies, and strengthened its foundations. But others were weak, careless, or completely unfit to rule. And each time that happened, the empire paid the price. Over time, the pattern became clear. Stability was temporary. Crisis was inevitable. Recovery was possible, but never permanent. The empire adapted again and again, splitting administrative control, reforming restructuring its economy, trying to solve problems that had no simple solutions. But every solution created new challenges. Every reform bought time, but never certainty. And slowly, the balance shifted. The western part of the empire grew weaker, more vulnerable, more exposed to pressure. While the eastern part, wealthier, more stable, more defensible, continued to survive and even thrive. This division was not sudden. It was the result of centuries of gradual change. And when the final moment came, it did not feel like the dramatic fall people often imagine. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor was removed from power. There was no massive final battle that ended everything. No single event that destroyed Rome. Instead, it was the culmination of a long process, a system that had been stretched, reshaped, and weakened over time, finally reaching its limit. The Western Roman Empire was gone. But Rome itself did not disappear. Its influence remained. Its ideas survived. Its laws, its culture, its structures continued to shape the world long after its political power ended. And in the East, the empire lived on for nearly another 1,000 years. Which brings us back to the beginning. Because the story of Rome is not just about the rise and fall of an empire. It is about transformation. The Republic did not simply fail, it evolved into something else. The empire did not simply collapse, it changed, adapted, and left behind a legacy that would define civilizations for centuries. And perhaps the most important lesson is this. Systems do not last forever. No matter how strong they seem, no matter how carefully they are built, they are always shaped by the people within them. The Roman Republic believed it could prevent absolute power. It believed its structure was strong enough to resist it. But in the end, it was not the system that decided Rome's fate. It was individuals, ambitious, strategic, flawed, who pushed it beyond its limits. And that is what makes Rome more than just history. It is a reminder. That power, once created, always seeks to grow. That stability, once achieved, can slowly turn into complacency. And that the line between a republic and an empire is thinner than it seems.